Let's
Now,
start. Yeah.
great. So uh, the talk that I'm going to give tonight is going to be, I guess I should actually go back to the title that it had, which is the rise and fall and rise question mark of Aden. And the first image that you see on the screen, among the holdings of the British Museum, warehoused in their massive storage among around 8 million objects, is a carved dark gravestone inscribed in Hebrew and dated 1333 AD from the port of Aden in Yemen. The inscription says, "Mayest thou rest in peace until the Redeemer cometh." In the month of Tebeth in the year 1644, was gathered in peace to her fathers the worthy, respected woman Madmiya, the daughter of Sa'diya, the son of Abraham. May his memory be blessed. The stone was donated to the museum in 1886, so about 500 years after it was actually laid on the grave of Madmiya, by Thomas Holdsworth Newman of the shipping firms Mr. Newman and Hunt and Company. The stone had been brought over to Britain, however, 30 years before that, so in 1836, when it had been used as ballast for a ship sailing from India to Zanzibar and onwards to Britain. I've tried to find out what sort of ship this was, but have not yet been successful. The shipping firm itself owned whalers in Newfoundland, owned vineyards in Oporto in Portugal, and traded with Mediterranean ports. There's much about this object that I would love to note here. It speaks of a long history of Jewish diasporic existence in Aden, in Yemen. It bespeaks of an imperial carelessness that plunders gravestones for ballast. And it points to Aden as a significant, perhaps the most significant, coaling station between Europe and India. I want to say a few words about ballast, and then I shall shift to Aden itself. In his beautiful short reflection on ship's ballast, Charlie Haley recalls Joseph Conrad's obsession with ballast, telling us that ships are either in cargo or in ballast, where the weight here of stone, later of coal, and still later of seawater is required to balance the ship when the ship is low on cargo. Landscapes were harvested of ballast, looted clean of sand and shingle and rock. And although ballast may speak of empty ships, of ships that have delivered their goods in one direction and are now sailing in the opposite direction with their cargo heaved to port, it also speaks of resource extraction in ways that can be considered unproductive, but which are fundamental to capitalist trade. This resource extraction transformed landscapes in ways that have been forgotten. Once a ship arrived in port, ballast had to be discarded, and despite laws that prevented the discharging of stone and shingle and sand into the sea, Haley tells us that discarded ballast spawned landscapes born of displaced materials from far-flung lands. And ballast islands and hills, this wastage, became infrastructure, with these unwitting spoils of trade repurposed for building roads and especially railways. Indeed, the kind of shingle that is used to keep the rail down in this country is called ballast. Today, when seawater from one geography is released, ballast seawater is released in port in another geography, there's much concern about invasive species, about this uncanny mixing of waters, organisms, and pollution. And the harvesting and dumping of ballast also echoes through the dredging and land reclamation processes that transform landscapes, looting far riverbeds of Myanmar, for example, for gravel to be poured on the seabeds of Singapore, or of ancient marine topographies ripped up to accommodate ships with deeper drafts. I think ballast is crucial in thinking about shipping precisely because it reminds us that the movement of ships across the sea is not simply about the movement of cargo, or about even production and circulation, or at least it doesn't stop there. The ostensible routes of trade also map geographies of empire and of new physical landscapes, of forms of labor and rule, of remade ecologies, and of course of forms of imperial hierarchy, which see nothing in using a 600-year-old gravestone of a young Jewish woman as a weight that keeps a ship in equilibrium. But ultimately, this talk is about Aden, And I want to talk about Aden because the rise and fall of Aden, as once the most important port of the Middle East and today as a destroyed backwater, lacerated by bombs and missiles and siege, also says something about other ghostly presences of the empire and imperial forms in today's logistics. Now, if you look at this picture of the port of Aden before 2011, you'll see something quite familiar, in fact, quite indistinct. I think a lot of these ports look very similar anywhere that you go. This sublime aesthetics, the awe and terror of logistical landscapes, all those extraordinary vast ports with their cranes reaching to the sky and the puzzle pieces of containers stacked in asymmetrical mountains often conjure up an irrevocable rupture from the past, heralding something new as yet unseen, as a kind of threshold of transformation in the character of capitalism. We hear about an age of logistics or technologies of circulation and automation that remake the world in ways not yet seen. I don't deny the awe that I feel when moving through these logistical landscapes, and my kids can testify that whenever we travel to a port anywhere, the first thing that I want to do is to see if they have any kind of a port tour, and usually a boat tour, so you could actually see the ports from inside. I think the number of times my children have seen the port of Barcelona is just that they're used to it now. Um, Whenever I visit a port city, the first thing I do is organize a tour of the industrial harbors, looking for the palimpsest of histories of trade in the crumbling wharves or the sleek and streamlined container terminals. I confess that flying over busy straits, whether it's Bosphorus or Malacca or Gibraltar, that extraordinary traffic in ships, especially the long, sleek tankers and the behemoth container ships, exhilarates me. But despite the feeling of newness in this aesthetic sublime, these logistical landscapes, both at land and sea, are haunted by their and our colonial pasts. In what remains of this talk, I'm going to reflect on these hauntings through a consideration of the emergence and decline of ports and maritime transport infrastructures in the Port of Aden. Whether it's route making and enduring transoceanic connections of labor and trade and war, or it is the geography of ports and inland transportation, crossroads and hubs, today's transportation sector echoes colonial pasts. And what I want to do here is to talk about these colonial pasts and the way that they have shaped today's Aden. Aden was conquered in 1839 by man-o-wars, warships, from the British Governorate of Bombay, which used the excuse of a ship's grounding and quote unquote outrage against its women passengers to open fire on the port of Aden and eventually annex it. It's interesting that white men coming to the rescue of white women from brown men was used as an excuse 150 years ago to annex Aden. But the reason that Britain was annexing Aden was because by that point, the East India Company, which had lost its monopoly on trade in India and China, needed urgently to gain upper hand in commerce. And so it switched its ships from sail to coal. And so it needed Aden as a coaling station on its sea route from India to Suez and overland to Alexandria, because at that point the Suez Canal was not yet built in the 1830s. It was in 1860s by the end of 1860s. So this is an image of Aden in 1864 and before the sort of the inauguration of the Suez Canal as a regular sort of stoppage, as a regular stopping point. As the city became a crucial possession of the empire, one of the most important coaling stations in the world, and especially after the opening of the Suez Canal with proper traffic in 1869, Aden could easily be considered the most significant port in the Arab world, indeed in the whole of the world east of Suez. I think at some point it was the fourth largest coaling station in the world after London, Liverpool, and New York City. With coal depots came inland trade, and as On Barak writes in a book on coal, railways, tramways, telegraphs, water pumps, all of which facilitated the movement and operations of policemen, judges, inoculation officials, and irrigation inspectors, not only in Aden, but deep into the hinterland. So the port itself was a way of incorporating the hinterland. Aden was so significant an outpost that many a well-known writer and poet earning a living as functionaries and merchants passed through there. Arthur Rimbaud, working as a coffee trader in Aden, lived in a house that faced the sea, but which in vast projects of land reclamation in the intervening years is now buried about a kilometer from the sea inland. Some decades later, in the 1930s, the great Paul Nizan, who had run away to Aden, wrote of the transformation in commodities of trade that had changed Aden already from coal to oil. He said, this is Nissan writing in his Aden Arabia. Not so long ago, Aden was a coaling station. Oil brought with it offices, docks, the black tanks of the Anglo-Persian and Asiatic petroleum, and intrigues that roused the emotions of the little native potentates who have become sellers of oil and buyers of gasoline for automobiles. A little war for thing all around. To extend coffee plantations, European wars have been undertaken. Vast territories have been conquered in the New World in Africa and in the Sunda Islands. Millions of slaves have been captured and transported to the new plantations. A revolution has been accomplished, entailing consequences incalculable in their complexity, in which frauds, warfare, oppression, and wholesale massacres go hand in hand with commercial enterprise. End quote. This intertwining of war, commerce, and transit, as Nizam called it, has continued. Aden was, until Britain was forced to abandon India, still a major way station. And even after 1947, it was an important outpost of the empire, guaranteeing the waning British supremacy over trade routes that brought oil and commodities to a war-devastated country. In fact, after the Iranians under Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil companies to be renamed BP, the British really sped up the construction of two competing refineries, one in Kuwait and one in Aden. And the one in Aden was going to be one of the biggest refineries in the world. So it was quite a significant place well into the 1950s. It was only a bloody rebellion in the 1960s that finally pushed the British out of Aden in 1967, with 1968 being the only year in the entirety of the 20th century when the British did not have mass troops in countries that were not part of the empire, meaning everywhere except for not like Northern Ireland was, of course, they did have troops there. In fact, that's when the Troubles began. Over 100 years after the annexation of Aden, and in the aftermath of bloody civil war of 1994, Aden became once again a commercial prize. This time, the conquest occurred not by British man-o'-wars, but by capital. And interestingly, capital not from Europe, but first by parastatal capital from Singapore and later parastatal capital from Dubai. Now, if you look at that map of the Arabian Peninsula, I'm not sure, I hope you can see my cursor on there, but Aden is at the very bottom, almost towards the center, and Dubai is almost diametrically across in the northeast quadrant of this image. The contract that gave Dubai Ports World Dubai Ports World is today the fourth largest port management container terminal management company in the world. The contract that gave Dubai Ports World the control over container terminals at Aden is said to have been secured through bribes to Ali Abdullah Saleh, who has now been deposed, who's long been deposed. There's a swirl of rumors and a rank of stories around the port and Dubai Port World's management of it. When I interviewed some people, they were telling me that what the DP World managers did was they actually redirected port traffic to other ports nearby, which Dubai Ports World also operated, including to Djibouti, which at the time it had control of in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and to Jebel Ali itself, which is near Dubai. And this is something that I heard when I was traveling around Indian Ocean for the news of war and trade. This is something that every port where Dubai Ports World managed the container terminals, they said that they actually ran down the sort of the amount, the ships, the number of ships that emerged, that arrived in those ports, and redirected them to some of the other ports, essentially monopolizing transit in their massive port of Jebel Ali, which is the number 10 port in the world, actually ahead of Rotterdam, and the only other ports ahead of it are in Asia or Southeast Asia. So Jebel Ali is a really significant transit port in Dubai. And that also explains why DP World, Dubai Ports World, is so significant. That Aden would be targeted for such subterfuge by Jebel Ali, by Dubai Ports World is not surprising. Its natural deep harbor and excellent location make it a more inviting proposition than Jebel Ali, whose harbor requires constant dredging to maintain access to the largest ships. In fact, it is so shallow that to arrive into the port, you have to follow very specific channels into Jebel Ali because otherwise ships will ground because it is really quite, the Persian Gulf is incredibly shallow. And of course, in order for ships to go to Jebel Ali, they'll also have to go through the Strait of Hormuz, which has traditionally been a flashpoint of conflict between Iran, usually the US, and other states. But that DP World engaged in such a subterfuge is not surprising, but that it engaged it in such a brazen and shameless way, and that the government of Yemen, that the government of Yemen was eventually forced to withdraw the company's contract. And part of the reason that they did so is because everybody who worked in the port of in the port in Aden, and Yemen has one of the largest sort of unionized group of workers in actually as a proportion of the population than anywhere else in the Middle East. I think they're only surpassed by Iraq historically, and the protest by those unionized workers was quite a significant element in that work. But in that maneuvering, also, there was something of the colonial company maneuverings, of concessions and contracts and monopolies wrested by force, and of contracts being considered provisional as far as profits and power are concerned. Today, Aden's port is in the process of reconstruction, but not long ago, it lay in ruins after the war waged on the country by Saudi Arabia and its allies, including the United Arab Emirates. In the swirl of conspiracy theories, one hears that part of the reason for the war was Saudi Arabia stoking, and for the war, Saudi Arabia's stoking of sectarian wars in Yemen itself. But the reason for it, the deeper reason for it, is because Saudi Arabia was in search of access to routes to the Indian Ocean. So if going back to this map, you can see that Saudi Arabia, while it has quite a long coastline on the Red Sea and a substantial coastline where the oil is produced on the Persian Gulf, it has no direct through line to the Indian Ocean. And with the increase in the amount of oil that is being shipped to China and India, that Indian Ocean route would be quite significant. Yeah. But that was one of the things that became clear, particularly after there was a leak to WikiLeaks of Arabic language bureaucratic memos from the government of Saudi Arabia, which talked about setting up finding routes to the Indian Ocean, either through Yemen or through Oman. And interestingly, while the Saudis fought a war against the Yemenis, they paid paid a substantial amount for the construction of a port in Durham, which you can't see on the map right now in Oman. But if you can see where there are two little islands just off the coast of Oman, that's where Durham is. And it's now essentially a major kind of a terminal and loading point for oil from Saudi Arabia, and their pipelines that are under construction there. So we know about all of this. Now, the brass knuckles form of geopolitical economy is unsurprising given the ways in which dream worlds of strategy are imagined in layers of power. And Aden is considered a strategic stronghold, not only for trade, but for military expansion across the East. The inextricability of commercial and military aims, of course, is absolutely nothing new. And anybody who knows me knows that I am obsessed with Moby Dick. And so I always love showing this map, which actually should extend further east into the Indian Ocean, because in fact, Moby Dick is a map of how whaling, as US whaling as a kind of a commercial venture, was inextricable from the US military expansion across the Pacific Ocean and into the Indian Ocean. When in 2015 and 16, I traveled on a container ship twice from Malta to Dubai, I have to confess to being overwhelmed with how incredible this travel was, the seas that you went through. And standing on the deck and looking out at the Mediterranean and then the Red Sea and then the Indian Ocean made me want to think of the sea as something eternal, transcendental, romantic, grand. And yet, I actually think about the sea in its three dimensions as a kind of a material body. In fact, it is made. So one of my most favorite websites, and I can spend hours on this, and I'm going to tell you guys what it is because you will want to as well, is called underseacables.com or .org. And what it is it's an interactive map of every single internet cable that it runs under the oceans. And it tells you who funds those, where it stops, where the sort of the starting points are. You can see one of the snapshots, one of the static snapshots from that in this, but you can see how incredible it is. And it is a kind of a map of the undersea, which we don't see in all of our romantic imaginings of the ocean. Underwater cables crisscross seabeds, and they follow the cables that were laid for telegraphs in the 19th century. And a book by Nicole Starosielski about these undersea internet cables tells us that this geography of undersea networks contain histories of cable laying, militarization, and economic deprivation, where new modes of spatial organization have led to the displacement of local residents, closure and enclosures of vast public spaces, and a reorganization of racialized labor regimes around these cable drop-off points. Much the same can also be said. So these cable drop-off points are invisible to us in this kind of a three-dimensional view of the sea, but they are fundamental to the geography, to the commercial and strategic geography of the ports. Just as important, perhaps even more important, is the stuff that we see at the ground level, which is the commercial ports and militaries that are commercial ports, and they're used by militaries and navies, but especially the US military, which have been implicated in this process of changing the sea into a space of violent extraction. So if you look at this incredible map, you can see that the vast majority of the bases that the United States has established, aside from the fact that they're in the Middle East, the vast majority of them are coastal. And that element of a kind of a maritime empire is quite crucial to the ways in which the US can kind of expand across the world. So, but I will invite you to ask me questions about Trump's plans for this kind of a maritime empire in the question and answers if you're interested. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that ports are strategic assets. commercial ships can be commandeered to haul material and personnel for warfighting. In fact, Maersk, whose beautiful baby blue containers everybody's accustomed to, is actually one of the closest allies, closest contractors for the US transportation of material. And it has been also one of the primary modes of transportation for the arms that the United States has been transferring to Israel. Logistics firms become warfighting machines and adjuncts of military logistics operations. And this has been true in every war fought by the US in the Middle East in particular. The US Army Corps of Engineers, for example, has been crucial in the construction not only of ports and dams and roads in the United States, for example, the levees in New Orleans or the dams that have justified the expropriation of land from the indigenous people in the West, but throughout the world. In Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and the Gulf, the engineering expertise of the US military has gone into the creation of a vast infrastructure of transport that can easily be transformed into warfighting assets. In fact, I'd like to tell a little story. I was brought up in the city of Mashhad in Iran, which is in the northeast corner. It's about 1,000 miles from the sea. And when I was a kid, it was 100 miles south of the border with what was then Soviet Union and 100 miles west of the border with Afghanistan. And while I was growing up, there was a road that was being built, which connected our very suburban neighborhood to the city of Mashhad. And that road, which was built courtesy of the United States with US funding, was called the Sento Road, after the Sento strategic treaty between Pakistan, Afghanistan, the United States, Turkey, and Iran under the Shah. And what was interesting was, of course, we loved the Sento Road because it was the best road in our entire area. Many years later, when I came to research that, I discovered that the guy that was in charge of the strategic, the US's strategic nuclear program, and somebody who's got a very colorful name because he did some terrible firebombing during one of the many wars that the US has fought. He had said, this road is one of the greatest assets that we can have because it is one of the closest roads we can have to the Soviet border, should we ever need to. And of course, the Soviet Union had placed a lot of its nuclear weapons at the time in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And so it was one of the closest roads you can find to those. And so that road was actually something that the tanks, US tanks, it was planned for the US tanks to use. And the US Army Corps of Engineers had been involved in the construction of that. So this fungibility of commercial infrastructures, logistical infrastructures, and warfighting infrastructures is a major characteristic of these kinds of infrastructures. And actually, it has been forever. It's not a modern thing. The British did it extensively. And then when the war is done, or done temporarily, these warfighting assets can be transformed again into instruments of capital, trade, and commerce. As Deborah Cowan has described in her extraordinary book on the deadly life of logistics, US bases and detention centers in particular lend themselves to this. She speaks of Camp Clark in the Philippines, which has yo-yoed between being a US base and a commercial logistics port 3 or 4 times in the last 30 years. But the one that she talks about, which of course falls within the Middle East area, and which is of great interest to me, is Camp Bucca, which was one of the 3 major places that the US JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, under General McChrystal, actually had one of its headquarters, and it was notorious for, or had its concentration, and it was notorious for tortures taking place therein. And once the US was forced to withdraw from Iraq, Camp Bucca was transformed to Qasr logistical city. It's right next to Basra. So this fungibility of the military and commercial functions of infrastructure is, of course, nothing new, and roads, markets, and schools were the holy trinity of colonial pacification through most of the 19th century. I unfortunately don't have any pictures to show, but also during the time that Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates fought, rained bombs down on Aden. The port in Aden was actually used for some of the replenishing of the forces of Abu Dhabi, or the mercenaries that were serving Abu Dhabi on the ground. So, um, if you look at these colonial trade routes in the 18th and 19th century, one of the things that becomes very clear is the extent to which these colonial trade routes are by and large maritime routes. So you can find some instances where there are routes that go inside the territories. And of course, that is particularly true in Africa, where a lot of the resources that were being extracted were inland. And Walter Rodney has a wonderful account of how of those they served. But by and large, when you look at these colonial trade routes, what you see is that they were maritime. And the East India Company in particular was a very important element of this. Actually, all of the East India companies of the French and the Dutch and the British. But the British one was particularly significant because of the ways in which the ships that operated under the British Aegis were fueled by coal rather than by sail. And so the establishment of coaling stations, shipping channels, harbors, shipping agencies, or factories, as they were called, military offices, all of that were infrastructural side effects, but also direct kind of outcomes of East India Company exploitation. It is precisely the intensity and volume of this investment required to support shipping and trade that allowed for these corporate states like East India Company or indeed some of the larger shipping companies that serve the empire. And what is extraordinary is the extent to which these routes tend to have a kind of a durability. So if you look at this marine traffic, the similarity and extent of their intensity, sorry, is quite astonishing. Although one of the things that we see that is slightly different is the density of this kind of a marine traffic on the Chinese Pacific coast. And one of the other things that is quite astonishing is the extent to which the thickness of the lines of trade that went through and past Aden has actually reduced, despite the fact that it still continues to on the Bab el Mandeb. Now, a final theme I'd like to discuss is the idea that shipping is for the movement of goods and people across borders, or, for example, the single market for the mobility of goods and people. Now, it's inevitable that one would think not only of goods and people, but also of people as goods or human cargoes. We constantly hear harrowing stories about people who have put everything at risk to get themselves and their families to safe havens, or people that have had to travel in long distances in order to act as workers, whether in Europe or crossing other kinds of channels. Of course, this is the human cargoes of indentured Indian laborers in South Africa. And the British, again, were quite crucial for the spread of these networks. But today, the Bab el Mandeb is again another site of sort of this crossing of these human cargoes, whether of Somali or Eritrean or Ethiopian or Sudanese migrants moving towards Yemen and Saudi Arabia, or in the other way, by Yemenis moving to the Horn of Africa when Saudi Arabia and the UAE rained fire upon the country. And that kind of that ebbs and flows of cargoes of trade is one story, and that's the rise and the fall. But I want to end with a story that is about the rise with the question mark. On 19th of November 2023, a helicopter operated by the Houthi-controlled Yemeni Navy hovered over a roll-on, roll-off vehicle carrier, Galaxy Leader, which was steaming through the Red Sea, just southwest of the port of Jeddah. Masked and armed military men rappelled down to the deck and raised Yemeni and Palestinian flags and directed the port of Hodeidah, further south along the Red Sea, and at some distance from Aden. Since Galaxy Leader has been berthed at the port, the ship has become a kind of a selfie hotspot, a wedding venue, and a backdrop for TikTok videos. It was only released in January of this year, and yet the picture over on the right is of the seafarers that were held for 14 months on the ship itself. The ship's crew, who most of whom were from the Philippines or Eastern Europe, in fact, ended up being kept, as I said, for 14 months. It's usually the sort of the unspoken cost of the kinds of wars that are fought between different sides, are often the people who have work in the sort of the wheels of commerce at this point. But there are some interesting elements of this that I want to also bring out. By that point, November 19th of 2023, we were 6 weeks into Israel's siege and slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. Nearly 13,000 Palestinians lay dead in the rubble. That number has of the people directly killed has surpassed 60,000 at the time of this writing, and perhaps many, many tens of thousands more. Despite brazen the Israeli cabinet, including Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's ordered life-sustaining infrastructure in Gaza, European and North American leaders continued to support the Israeli campaign in Gaza. Amidst this geopolitical grotesquerie, the Houthis controlled the capital Sana'a and the most populous part of Yemen, enacted a blockade in the Red Sea against vessels, quote unquote, linked with Israel. In the immediate aftermath of the ship's arrest, Israel claimed that the vessel was British-owned and Japanese-operated, which is one of those interesting things that has happened most recently with flags of convenience. You can have a ship that is owned by one person in one country, but it's registered in another. The company is registered in one country, and its ships are registered in a third country. In this case, the ships were owned by a company called Ray Car Carrier. They were chartered by Japan's Nippon Yusen, better known as NYK. And the ships themselves actually flew the flag, I believe, of Panama. So the fact that that Israel was claiming that the ship was not linked with Israel ignored the ownership structure. And the fact that the Ray car carrier, which is registered in the Isle of Man, owns a fleet of 65 ro-ro ships and is owned by this Israeli billionaire Rami Ungar. Ungar is one of Israel's biggest automobile importers and is known as a friend and funder of various Israeli politicians, including Yoav Gallant, whom he treated to the 2018 World Cup in Russia. They went together and had really good tickets. Now, in the weeks that followed the Galaxy Leader event, 13 of the 29 ships targeted by swarms of drones or missiles operated by the Yemeni Navy forces suffered a direct hit. Though some of the ships were hobbled, no crew members suffered injuries. Earlier, a few months later, a Houthi leader invited vessels sailing through the Red Sea to add a tag to their automatic identification system. It's a numeric system that you have to display on that actually you transmit it. And the automatic identification system contains information such as, for example, where the ship is registered, what cargo it's carrying, and what flag it's flying. And it's got the name of the ship on there. And when I was traveling, one of the things that was really interesting was that military or naval vessels often turned off their AIS. So you couldn't see on the screen, you couldn't see if there were any ships nearby. So one of the times that we were going, there was an aircraft carrier going by and you could see it going by, but the AIS showed nothing. The radar did, but the AIS did not. Anyway, so when the Houthi leaders invited vessels sailing through the Red Sea to add a tag to their automatic identification system identifier, declaring that their ships have no link with Israel. So there were two responses immediately. Lloyd's List reported that some ships actually added a tag that said, "We have armed guards on board," and most of these were either Russian or Israeli. But almost all the other ships started adding a tag to their name that said, "Not touching Israel." This Houthi activity also had another effect. Maritime insurance companies began increasing the war risk premium on all vessels traversing the Red Sea. The cost of insurance for a $100 million cargo ship went from $10,000 to $1 million. So the insurance cost went from 10,000 to 1 million on the cargo and the ship itself. The volume of cargo passing through the Suez Canal fell by about 45% by some estimates, and for container ships by 60%, with almost half of all the ships on the Israel-Europe circuit choosing to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope. This precipitous drop of traffic through the Suez Canal, of course, then hit Egypt particularly hard, since the country is dependent on canal fees for a steady supply of foreign currency. In addition, just-in-time manufacturing schedules in Europe and Asia were also disturbed, as the longer journey around the African continent added somewhere between 10 and 20 days to the supply chain circuits between the two countries. In Israel, the port of Eilat was most directly affected by the blockade, sitting as it does on the top of one of the northern arms of the Red Sea. With the Houthi attacks, the port's operating company declared bankruptcy in 2024. Eilat is, after Haifa and Ashdod, the third largest port in Israel. It is the primary port in the country for automobile imports, for the Ro-Ro car carriers that Rami Ungar has such a big stake in. But it is also importantly one of the terminuses of the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline, which receives petroleum primarily from the United Arab Emirates. Now, this oil supplies Israeli refineries at Haifa and Ashdod, and it only produces not energy, not industrial energy. It's not used for energy or industrial production, but rather it produces refined products that can be used as gasoline. But the vast majority of it is actually shipped through the Mediterranean from Ashkelon onwards to Europe. 70% of Israel's energy needs are met from natural gas resources from its offshore Mediterranean fields, and the rest by coal imports from Australia, Brazil, and South Africa, all of which, except for the Brazilian coal and Colombian coal, were also affected because the ships coming from Australia had to go all the way around. In addition, livestock cargoes that were also coming from Australia and New Zealand were also affected by the blockade. The most significant ramification of the Houthi action on Israel, however, was political. A few weeks after the first Houthi attacks, possibly inspired by the Houthis, the government of Malaysia directed the ports operators in the country to ban ships en route to Israel or owned by Zim. Founded by the Jewish Agency for Palestine in 1945, Zim is today one of the world's largest shipping companies. But throughout its history, whether as a state-owned or a privatized firm, Zim has functioned as a kind of as an arm of the state, and it is known to have provided cover for and collaborated with Mossad in its operations overseas. Malaysia's actions and Chinese vessels' AIS disavowal of Israel were seen as strategic victories for Houthis in trying to politically isolate Israel. Predictably, Biden administration could not countenance Israel's isolation, and in December of 2023, with some fanfare and a feeling of dissembling about its membership, announced Operation Prosperity Guardian, a naval exercise to protect shipping through the Red Sea. The Pentagon named the participants of the operation as the UK, Australia, Bahrain, Canada, France, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, the Seychelles, and Spain. Shortly thereafter, Spain, Italy, and France all announced that while they would continue to have naval vessels in the Red Sea, they would not place their forces under US command. The contributions of Norway and the Netherlands was about a dozen naval officers in total billeted to Bahrain, the headquarters of the Combined Maritime Forces, which is a multilateral naval grouping of NATO and EU countries based there both to protect the flows of oil, but also trade through the Red Sea over on the other side of the Arabian. Most of the ships announced by the participants in the operation were already guarding shipments through the Western Indian The U.S. has also claimed that additional 8 states are participating in were participating in the exercise, but that they had opted for anonymity. The fact that so many governments did not want to be publicly associated with this initiative adjudges the goal of the operation to limit the political isolation of Israel, a kind of a failure. But I want to end with noting some of the ironies, historical ironies in the Houthi blockade, which has been now halted pursuant to the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. In the late 1960s, the last Zaidi king in Yemen was Muhammad al-Badr. In a better time, this is from 1959, in a better time with Gamal Abdel Nasser. But in the late 1960s, as of course there was a huge revolt going on in Aden, in northern Yemen, Nasserist officers, young officers, revolted against Muhammad al-Badr. And this revolt ended up in a major civil war in the north. In that civil war in the north, al-Badr, who was in a sort of the monarch, if you will, he was the Zaidi Imam, was supported by the British and Saudi Arabia, which interestingly got the agreement of the Israeli pilots to deliver weapons to Badr's forces in order for them to fight Nasser. So it was a kind of a proxy war in which the British, the Israelis, and the Saudis were supporting the Muhammad al-Badr on the left, and Nasser on the right was supporting the young officers. What's ironic about this, of course, is that the Houthis belong to the Zaidi community to which Badr belonged. And Egypt today, of course, is one of the closest Arab allies of Israel and coordinates directly in all sorts of security matters with the country. So there is an interesting reversal there. There are also some of the other elements that have changed since then is the emergence of forms of technology that are actually intended to, for example, facilitate trade, like the AIS, like electronic bills of lading, like various kinds of information that you can immediately look up online and find out as much information as you want about any kind of ship. And what this has done today is that this information, which anybody can access, shows ports of origin, transit, and destination. And bills of lading can be accessed online with a little bit of with a small subscription. The attacks on ships, therefore, can be much more targeted, and therefore they can be actually quite politically directed. But the other irony, of course, of all of these is that during Operation Prosperity Guardian, the US and Britain have launched deadly attacks. They launched deadly attacks almost daily against scores of targets in Yemen, including in Sana'a, Hodeidah, and even in Aden, and killed dozens of Houthis. Meanwhile, as the naval vessels in the area moved further into the Red Sea to intercept Houthi attacks, a few hundred nautical miles to the south in the Gulf of Aden, and after a lull of something like 10 years, Somali pirates began operations yet again, in part because there were no longer those military or naval forces to accost them. So to me, there's an interesting interconnection here between the military actions, the commercial movements, and even the licit and illicit easily blend into each other and move away from one another. And I think that Yemen in particular is a really fascinating node for the studying of all of these transformations across a couple of hundred years. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful and gigantic kind of elucidation of the complexity between the military and the industrial and how they incredibly closely are intermingled. So by looking at the trade, I mean, as you've done in your essays as well, you can see how it's a a part of the military, really, and they can change very easily a trading post to a military post. And of course, it's
Yes.
all aligned like that. And it becoming aware of all this, how this is done, and these trading routes, I think, is very helpful for us because it's very easy to be in the Western, easy world where we're all sort of nearly middle class or somewhere, or we think we are, and it's all quite far away, but it is actually all very nearby. And I mean, thank you so much. So we have time for questions, and you did offer that you might answer the question about where things might be going with Trump in all this. And I mean, he did say that things have strangely swapped sides also. Yeah,
Yes.
in terms of like what you said about Badr and
Yeah.
Nasser and the Houthis and so on. So
Yeah, I
my
think that
first question.
So I think that the switching of sides is, to me, one of the ironies of the kind of politics that emerges in the region. When I was researching Sinews of War and Trade, one of the things that I was really struck by was the incredible radicalism of the Arab workers in the ports in the Gulf, which we today see as, sites of extraordinary exploitation of migrant labor. And it's precisely the processes that was put into effect in order to sort of suppress those forms of mobilization, which have been, which are acting in ways that are shaping the politics of the region. But what I wanted to talk about Trump, which I find really fascinating, is of course. You guys probably know and heard about Trump's first the call for um, the US to buy Greenland, and then the second for the US to militarily, if necessary, to take over Panama Canal. And there's a history behind both of those and a kind of a present importance to both of those, which has to do directly with shipping. Now, Greenland was one of the sites where the US actually maintained its nuclear weapons. It flew nuclear weapons over that site. It had this kind of a close association with the US Strategic Command. But it is also today one of the places that if you look at one of the maps of the North Pole, Greenland actually flanks the North Pole in a really the sea in the North Pole in ways that are juts into it in ways that are incredibly it is the largest sort of land mass in that sea. And with the melting of the ice caps, so with climate change, one of the things that's going to end up happening is that, and it already is, this Arctic route is going to become open,
Mm.
and this Arctic route is going to connect eastern sort of East Asia, the most easternmost parts of Asia, which are some of the places where China's largest factories are, over to Europe in a much shorter for a much shorter distance, and for a much longer period during the year, because of course, as you know, the ice cap is in place usually between something like September to March. But as the length of the summer increases, that becomes a more navigable space. And so Greenland sitting on that space ends up becoming quite an important maritime element. The second, Panama Canal, of course, Suez Canal was built by corvée labor, peasant labor that has been forced into work under French engineers, and they dug a ditch in the desert. The Panama Canal, which Ferdinand de Lesseps, the engineer that designed Suez, also had designs for Panama, but they ran out of money, and so the U.S., which was particularly which was consolidating its power in its own Western sort of in the west of the country, and really wanted a kind of a quicker way to be able to have maritime transportation for its cargoes, both of oil and of grain that was grown in the West. and that would have been much quicker to go through the isthmus in Central America, and so they paid for that bit of land, and in return for that, they supported the Panamanian elite to go independent from Colombia. And of course, that was also a lot of Afro-Panamanians and other Caribbean workers, usually of African origin, were put to work in extraordinarily bad conditions, many of whom died of malaria, etc. But the US has always had a claim, a kind of an imperial or slash colonial claim to the Panama Canal. But what Trump specifically was saying about Panama Canal was that because the Chinese Hong Kong-based port management company Hutchinson controls the two ports at the two ends of the canal, that in fact it can control the canal itself. And what we've seen, actually, there was a bit of news today that Hutchinson, I'm sure commanded by the Chinese government, because Chinese government is trying to placate the Americans because they don't want a war. That Hutchinson has just sold its concession to those ports, as well as to 43 other ports outside of China, to BlackRock, a US-based asset management company.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's really fascinating because this is like an imperial contest over ports of trade, but over also strategic spaces. And it seems to be an imperial contest between the US wielding its military and commercial might, and China yielding, and nobody's listening to the Panamanians themselves. The third thing that has been really interesting is among the many things, among the many tariffs and taxes that, or fees that Trump has suggested, one of them has been a tax on ships manufactured in China. Not ships belonging to Chinese companies, not ships flying Chinese flags, not ships even under the sort of aegis of Chinese shipping companies, ships manufactured in China, which is kind of an absurd thing because today 50% of the world's largest ships, freighters, are manufactured in China. So in essence, what they're saying is that they're going to tax Maersk, which is based in Denmark, and CMA CGM, which is headquartered in France, and MSC, which is headquartered in Switzerland, although it's an Italian company, plus Zim. In fact, Zim buys its ships from China. It's an Israeli shipping company. So it's kind of like it is, to me, this is astonishing. And of course, all the shipping companies are in a tizzy about this because this means that they all will have to pay much larger fees to the United States in order to placate the Trump administration.
Fascinating. It is very fascinating. Thank you very much for that. Are there any hands up? Are there any hands up for, do I see anybody? Chats. Let me have a look. Chats. Nope. Anybody? Are there anybody? Yep. Steve. We have Steve here. He's going to ask a question.
Yeah, you dealt very briefly with the Aden emergency, but I remember I was at school at the time when that happened, and we got the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph boasting about how Colonel Mad Mitch had marched into Quetta and all of that. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, we saw on the telly British troops had to march out backwards with their bayonets pointing at the crowd, throwing rocks at them.
Yeah.
And that's a sort of that was one of the first sort of really public anti-imperialist things that we saw on the telly. And I think, there's that history about Aden that I think if you could say a bit more about that kind of, you mentioned the militancy of the port workers and so on. If you could say a bit more about that, that would be that would be good.
Yeah. So my second book, which I haven't mentioned, is called Time in the Shadows, and it is about counterinsurgencies. This is about the history of counterinsurgencies. Actually, Aden plays a significant role in that, and part of the reason that it does is because Aden was a kind of a pivot point for the British. What I mean by a pivot point was it came at the kind of a tail end of a whole series of really brutal counterinsurgencies, which, as Steve mentions, hadn't really featured in the press. So Malaysia or Malaya, as it was, or indeed Kenya with the Mau Mau, the Gikuyu insurgency there, and a number of other insurgencies in a lot of other places, and those kind of simply just went under the radar. Cyprus, and then Aden happens, and because of a number of different elements, it ends up being quite a significant it makes a significant dent on, or it makes a significant impression on the British public, at least, or the world public. The reasons. Number one, this is, of course, the age of television. And I think that actually ends up being quite a significant factor in images from Aden being broadcast. Number two, this is the moment at which Amnesty International had started. And I actually went through all of the archival materials for Amnesty. And it is fascinating to see that it's a lot of it is kind of liberal, whatever, hand-wringing. And in fact, it's, let us make, your imperial job much nicer and much easier. But at the same time, they are actually very concerned about torture in the various kinds of dungeons that the British are running. So the emergence of a kind of a human rights discourse at the same time that you've got this intense struggle for liberty in Aden going on ends up being another factor in this making a major impression. But there's also the fact that Aden, and in fact all of Yemen, but particularly the Aden and its surrounds, were quite significant because of the presence of Yemenis in diasporic communities across Europe and indeed North Americas, because Yemenis, and particularly those from the port cities and coastal cities, but also some from the mountains, were a seafaring diaspora, a little bit like the Lascars of India and elsewhere, and that's the fact that they were a seafaring diaspora means that they had a presence in lots of places, including, for example, in Wales, including, for example, in South Shield, and in a lot of other places. And this this kind of in Cardiff actually was one of the oldest Muslim diasporas, and this very articulate, very radical diaspora was quite important in sort of pushing forward the Yemeni story. In addition to that, and I think this is also significant, is a lot of those Yemenis actually went to work in the oil industries in the region. And many of them were, because of the fact that this was a seafaring port and area, many of them were exposed to radical ideas, including communism. And there was a very significant proportion of these workers that were getting expelled from, for example, Aramco and elsewhere, expelled by the Saudis and from the other oil producing places, because, and again, this is all over the archives, because they were agitating for rights. And this kind of an articulate collection for forms of contention around labor rights is then transferred back into Aden and into Yemen, and ends up being an incredibly important kind of trigger and catalyst for political mobilization there. This is also a moment of armed struggle against the empire, and that armed struggle against the empire was picking up everywhere. It wasn't just in Aden, it was all over Africa. It was already had just swept like a wildfire in Latin America. And so that element is also part of sort of the global movement towards liberation, anti-colonial liberation, which makes that quite an interesting moment.
It is. We've got Riyad here, would like to ask a question or make a contribution. I'm just going to click on. Hello, Riyad.
Oh,
It's your
hello.
turn.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic, absolutely fantastic talk. The breadth of it was amazing, and it makes you think very differently about the role of the sea and the oceans. You touched tantalizingly on the indentured labourers coming on the way to South Africa. My great grandfather was an indentured labourer who was travelling from India to work on the sugar plantations in Mauritius. Could
Yes.
you say a bit about some of the role of the ports that you've studied in that trade? I know it's kind of been covered a lot, but anything specific that you were aware of in your research?
Yes. So, can I make a suggestion of a new book that I think it blew me away when I read it. It's called Apartheid Remains by Sharad Chari. It's a doorstop of a book, but it is about those Indian citizens of or South Asian or citizens of South Africa of South Asian origin, many of whom were brought over as indentured workers, and it is an amazing account of the kinds of relationships that they social, economic, and political that they developed in the ports in South Africa. But you're absolutely right also about some of the other ports. I was recently in sorry, there's a bit of a sound in the background that's a little bit
I'll
distracting.
mute myself. I'm at the airport. Let me
Oh,
mute
okay.
myself. A
Okay.
different form of travel.
So I was recently in a gallery in Dubai, and they had these amazing artworks that were done by actually Mauritian artists of South Asian origin, and who had women who had been brought to these sugar plantations to work, and women were seen to be much better workers, and so there was this kind of an amazing movement, and it was a form of social engineering that the British engaged in a lot of different places. One of the places that they actually did that sort of thing was actually across the Bab el-Mandab. So they facilitated the movement, for example, of people of Somali descent to come and work in the ports in Yemen, because so many of the Yemenis themselves were actually seafarers and lascars out on British ships. So the entire port system, the entire maritime world of the Western Indian Ocean was essentially a playground. Originally, a lot of these routes were obviously facilitated by the British Empire, but it's also really important to recognize that there was an enormous amount of agency of the actual seafarers, of workers, and of people who moved around. They were mobile peoples that looked for different ways of surviving. And because these channels, once established, remained quite active across decades, sometimes even across a century or two, those kinds of connections tended to be reproduced again and again and again. One I'm sure everybody here knows, and I don't have to say anything to you, but about this to any of you guys. But one of the things that makes, for example, some of the neighborhoods in East London, Whitechapel, Wapping, Shadwell, so interesting is that they were actually originally some of the oldest Lascars neighborhoods in anywhere in this country, and so that history of the South Asian presence in those neighborhoods is not something new that goes back to the 1970s and post Enoch Powell. It actually goes back 3 to 400 years, and digging through that history, you begin to realize the significance both of empire, but also of the agency of these kinds of mobile, hyper-exploited, but also hyper-mobile workers across this vast network, primarily in the Indian Ocean, but also then connecting to the metropole.
Thank you very much. We got Tony wanting to speak to you.
Wonderful.
Tony, your turn.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Tony, I think you are my son's teacher.
I'm not paid.
No, but I'm fairly certain that you've taught my son at some point, or my daughter. I can't remember. Anyway, please.
Right. Okay, thank you. Like Steve, and thank you very much for a very illuminating talk. It was wonderful. Sorry if I'm silhouetted. It's the way that my light is being. I won't explain it, but I've arranged it completely wrongly. There's nothing in front of my screen, but I am who I say I am. Like Steve, I remember Mad Mitch and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders marching into and out of Aden. And then following that, if I remember rightly, there was a defence review by Dennis Healy with the withdrawal from east of Suez, which in many ways was instigated or pushed for by the United States. That was the era still when the United States wanted to eliminate British influence in the Middle East as much as possible. Whereas today, of course, they want to integrate it and to increase it, if anything, which says quite a lot about the way imperialism works at the moment. But what I wanted to ask you, and I know it's a bit beyond the realm of your talk, but you mentioned the Houthis and what they've done in the intersection of the shipping and so on, and the vast increase in insurance for those ships that do dare to pass through the waterways. And I wanted to ask you, we see today as never before the way that the Arab countries have given their support in one way or another to Israel. We have the trade routes through Jordan from the UAR. We have other forms of support. And the one exception to that really are the Houthis. I mean, Iran has been playing its own game, and I don't think very well, with its so-called axis of resistance, which has collapsed at the first puff of wind, as it were. But why do you think that the Houthis, alone amongst the Arab regimes, have stood fast when all the rest of them have crumbled? And I know that's a big question, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd be interested if you have any ideas.
So it's actually a question I have thought about a lot. So I think there are so I think there are a lot of both domestic reason and international reasons, regional kinds of developments, but also international developments that result in that. So the broader context is that the Houthis are indeed a group that have been pushed into a position of radicalism, perhaps beyond their own smaller set of concerns. And in part, this is because of the way that the larger geopolitical and geoeconomic interests of Saudi Arabia and the UAE have come to shape this kind of an opposition. And so the Houthis have found a kind of an ally in Iran. And so the larger sort of imperial context has been one factor. I think the second factor, and I think this is quite significant and it's much more of a local element, is that there has consistently been a Saudi interest, often strategic and geographic rather than directly economic, like in terms of extractive materials it needs or in terms of resources, but rather in terms of its location in Yemen. There are the Al Saud have, from the moment that they took over Hijaz and Najd, began making ventures trying to cut off little by little bits of Yemen and make their way into the Indian Ocean. And they haven't been able to, in part because of the geography of the region, where the bits that are closest to Saudi Arabia are extremely mountainous and they're quite difficult, but in part also because there are very distinct cultural differences across that kind of a region because of much more localized both religious but also actually historic and cultural community differences, property regimes, modes of production, etc. But there's a third reason, and that is that they are ideologically more radical. I think, like most minoritarian groups in a majority or minoritized groups, not minoritarian, minoritized groups in a country where they are numerically quite significant, but nevertheless they have been minoritized, they often adopt forms of political radicalism, which we see examples of, for example, with Hezbollah as well in Lebanon, meaning that they are numerically, demographically quite a large segment, but because of the power dynamics, they have been pushed into both economic and politically marginalized positions, which generates often a kind of radical politics. And so I think there is genuine radical politics here. And then, as I said, there's also the sort of the geopolitical alliances with Iran that gives them a measure of pushback or at least support when they're fighting against the near neighbor that is constantly threatening them, which is Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much. What other, have we got other people here asking questions? We're coming towards, obviously coming, here we got Michael. Michael, your turn, Michael.
Yeah, okay, hello. Just you mentioned UAE, and I'm very glad you did, because I just finished reading an article in Le Monde Diplomatique, the English version, about UAE's little attempt at being a little Sparta in the region and carving its own little mini imperium out, so if you care to say a little something about that. And apparently as well, UAE and Israel have very strong military ties, and in actual fact, Israel's anti-missile defense starts in UAE. So when the Iranian attacked on Israel in retaliation, some of that was already stymied at UAE's borders, or skies or whatever. Yeah, thank you.
That is a topic very close to my heart. So the United Arab Emirates, of course, as you know, is 7 little emirates that each of whom had a treaty of protection with the British, along with Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, and they were called the trucial states before they gained their independence. The 7 emirates that became the United Arab Emirates, originally they were meant to include Qatar as well, but the Qataris, there's like the old ruling families had familial conflicts with both the Bahrainis and with those in power in Abu Dhabi, and that actually those kinds of conflicts have remained, as we know, as we saw, for example, with the blockade that the UAE and Saudi Arabia enacted against Qatar. Inside the United Arab Emirates itself, you have very interesting politics, because Sharjah and Dubai were quite significant or relatively significant ports on the Gulf, because they were ports of merchant trade along with Kuwait and Manama and Bahrain. Saudi Arabia was nothing on that side. It had Jeddah on the other side, on the Red Sea, which was quite significant. But on the Gulf side, it was actually Dubai, Sharjah, and Bahrain and Kuwait, which were quite important. Sharjah and Dubai were trading places, which means, like most trading places, they had cosmopolitan connections, they had large-scale maritime connections, and they had merchant communities. And merchant communities have a tendency to be more outward-looking. And they're also considered to be as a kind of a competition to the ruling clans that end up being put into place often through those treaties by the British. And so in those two cities, Sharjah and Dubai, because of the presence of the merchant communities, there was a little bit of a respite, let's say. There was more breathing space against the ruling families of those two places. Abu Dhabi was nothing. It was not even a proper teeny village until oil was discovered. And once oil was discovered in the 1970s, it was discovered in this much earlier than that, but it was really properly developed in the 1960s and 70s, then it actually becomes quite powerful. And precisely because of this kind of an origin story, because of where it starts, it ends up, its alliances tended to be, and the ruling family in Abu Dhabi, the grandfather of the current rulers were violently deposed by the British. So they really didn't like the British, but they were quite happy with the Americans. That in part explains the sorts of alliances that Abu Dhabi has made. And it also explains some of the tensions between Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Sharjah. Sharjah's ruling family were the only Nasserist, the only Nasserist ruling family in all of that Gulf area, and that caused all sorts of problems with the British for them, for example. So so there's an interesting ruling families, but there's also the structure of sort of the merchant bourgeoisie, and then of course there's, as I said earlier in the talk, there were very active workers that sort of struggled for power, and that shaped to some extent the politics of these places. That's why Kuwait, until recently, had a parliament. That's why Bahrain has had a parliament, although it keeps getting deposed. That's why Dubai and Sharjah are relatively more, well, they're more like port cities than Abu Dhabi is. Abu Dhabi is like a little Sparta. And
in the winter garden.
And so it's being a little Sparta comes out of that sort of the point of origin in the 1970s, the protection of oil, the trade in petrodollars for weapon dollars. As for the relationship with Israel, this is also quite interesting because, of course, as you know, the Shah of Iran had a very close relationship to Israel. I wrote a piece for Granta last year where, during the research for it, I discovered something that even as an Iranian who had lefty parents and knew everything about Israel and Iran, I did not know. Every single Israeli prime minister, with the exception of Moshe Sharet, visited Iran between 1948 and 1979 when the revolution happened. Every single Israeli prime minister, including Begin, which is kind of amazing. And once the Shah of Iran was deposed in the Iranian Revolution, the US really needed a kind of another pillar to support to have an ally with Israel, and they tried all sorts of things. There was Camp David Accord, of course, with the Egyptians. Later there was Oslo with Jordan, and there was always all sorts of weird commercial relations that were being conducted in secret between the Gulf monarchies, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And Israelis. There were all sorts of commercial relations. And when it came to questions of intelligence and sort of security and surveillance software, Abu Dhabi and Israel were like this and have remained like that. There is a huge amount of collaboration where the UAE puts in the money and the Saudis provide the sort of the technology know-how that comes out of using Palestine as a laboratory.
That's a
depressing note on which to end.
I know. Maybe we could.
Well, on a happier note, one of the things that one has to remember is that despite there is no technological determinism here, they could use these surveillance technologies, but those can also be turned against them. I mean, I think one little point that I like mentioning is that I don't know if you guys remember that there was a Palestinian, it was actually, I think, a Hamas leader that was poisoned by Mossad in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi, and within 24 hours, because they had done so without the approval or knowledge of the government of Abu Dhabi, the government of Abu Dhabi posted the pictures of the 26 Mossad agents that had come into the country for everyone to see. And the way that they'd done so was through a facial recognition software that they had bought from the Israelis, that they had financed from the Israelis themselves. So, it's like unintended consequences. Everything can.
Yeah,
it might have been Khalid Mishal. Might have been Khalid.
Yes, Khalid. Yeah. That's it. Exactly. Anyway.
But I think that's marvelous. Great to finish on this note. We can see it can be dialectical, it can shift, it can transform. And
Indeed.
it's really wonderful. Now I think we are we are in such a time where transformation can just take place, and maybe we're going to be lucky. And it does, I think, there's a lot of people who are have hope all over the world that something can